This morning. We will be talking about the new economic development is green and it comes with money. So thank you for joining us this morning to this afternoon. My name is Melissa Keene. I'm the Director of Enterprise Programs and Special Projects at ILG and will be your host and moderator for today's webinar. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get started. As you're joining, you've probably noticed that you are muted. You will be muted for the duration of today's webinar, just given the size of the audience we're anticipating, but that doesn't mean you can't talk to us. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to drop questions into that Q&A box at any point during the webinar. We will be monitoring it throughout, responding to logistical questions and comments, and then we will have time at the end of today's webinar for a Q&A with you all. So at any point, again, just please drop those in. We also, as you noticed, are recording today's webinar, and we will be sharing that recording as well as the materials from today's session with you all shortly after today's webinar. So a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. So right now we're just doing welcome and introductions. And then I'm going to turn it over to Larry Cosmont, who is with ILG partner Cosmont Companies, and he's going to provide an overview of the context for today's conversation. And then we're going to hear some fantastic presentations from his colleague, Joseph Dieguez, Deputy City Manager of Santa Cruz, Bonnie Lipscomb, Brian Coleman from GoBiz, and Steve Smwelian from California Consulting. We're going to share different components of this project process and the opportunities available to you all. And then, as I mentioned, we will have time for an audience Q&A, and we will wrap up and adjourn by 1 o'clock. Before we jump in, I just want to share a little bit about ILG in case you aren't super familiar with us. We are a statewide nonprofit that's affiliated with the League of California Cities, the California State Association of Counties, and the California Special Districts Association. So we work with our local government partners statewide to do a number of things. We provide education and training like today's webinar, conference sessions, longer format trainings. We also provide technical assistance, capacity building and convening services to local governments statewide. And we focus in 4 main issue areas. We have a program focused on leadership and governance, which some of the baseline requirements for local agencies, how to work together as a more effective governance team. Civics education and workforce, helping local agencies navigate the pipeline into public service, address recruitment and retention challenges. Right now, we're exploring non-traditional public sector apprenticeships, things of that nature. We have a program focused on public engagement to help you all more proactively and authentically engage your communities, thinking about project-specific efforts or city or county or district-wide efforts, and how to do that more proactively and in this ever-changing environment we're in. And then sustainable and resilient communities, where this webinar is part of, but we also do a lot around climate action and housing and land use, and things of that nature for you all. So I encourage you to check out our website and a lot of the free resources we have if you aren't familiar with us, or reach out to us offline. Already high level introduced our presenters, but you see them on the screen now, and they will each share a little bit more information about themselves and their background as they jump into their presentations as we go through the next 90 minutes. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Larry to kick us off and provide some context about the conversation that we're going to be having today. So Larry.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Good.
Okay,
well, welcome everyone. First, I'd like to say thank you to Melissa and the whole ILG team. Cosmont is privileged to be a partner with ILG. They serve such an incredible purpose for public agencies and private investors up and down the state. Erica, Melissa, Nikita, John, all of the team, amazing to deal with. So we appreciate it. And we appreciate the ability to bring this information to you. And you'll see a lot of, I think, cutting edge material today. Just a very short thought on why we came to have this presentation, and that's because in our practice, we focus on 3 areas: real estate, economic development, and public finance. Let me go to the next slide. That brings us to the point where we have a view of the industry as it affects public agencies and private sector investment that we think is really important to convey, because it sets the strategy for going forward on an economic development perspective. I mean, we know, I'm a former city manager, Cosmont's been in business for 39 years. And before that, I spent a number of years in the public sector running communities. And the business of economic development has always been the counterbalance to all the services that we have to fund and that we have to deploy on behalf of our constituents. So sort of the art and the science of being able to have a great community starts with providing incredible service and being responsive to constituents, but it ends at the very nexus of being able to afford those. And in a post-redevelopment, in a post-COVID digital economy, the circumstances of survivability, the circumstances of economic implications have shifted so dramatically that all of us in the economic development business, where we intersect with the private sector, need to be clear on where consumer activity is going, on where private investment wants to go because of consumer activity. We are in a 65% consumer-based economy. And what does all that mean for property tax, sales tax, and other forms of dollars that we can attract to our community to advance quality of life? That's the formula. And despite all the turbulence that you're seeing today, I can tell you that energy and climate resiliency investment is going to drive this economy without a doubt. And consumer preferences are going to be driving us to a conclusion that says, wow, the retail store has just changed forever. The retail economy has changed forever. The working economy has changed. People don't want to commute. They're not always going to go into an office. There will be a balance in how all that works. But because of those activity changes, the way people spend, where they spend, and how much revenue is there for us and how we can engage private investment in the context of all that activity becomes the equation for going forward. Hence, the title is The New Economic Development is Green. It's tied to sustainability. It's tied to climate action. It's tied to energy resources. And it's reflective of consumer preferences in a digital world that's come out of a pandemic era. So that's what we want to talk about. Next slide, please. The world is always going to change on us. And the reason why we think this particular session is so critical, because it's already shifted and it's about to shift again because of AI. But in today, as we sit here trying to figure out how do we make our communities better, how do we manage local economies so that they're productive, we have to understand that private investment sort of drives the train. We're a service business. When you run cities and counties and public agencies, you're a service business. So you're the tail wagging the dog. You're the tail being wagged by the dog, without a doubt. So what do you have to control that conversation? What do you bring to the table to manage to a better result? Two things that private investment would want: development entitlement, zoning, and public funding to the extent they need it. And by the way, make no mistake about it, in a 7% plus cost interest rate economy, public money is more important than ever. So the key to the equation is to first understand the pieces of it. And what you're really trying to do is figure out how to leverage private investment in your community, which is driven at some level by public policy and consumer demand. And what's that public policy? It's housing and sustainability. If you really look at all the things that the state does, I mean, 2,000 plus pieces of legislation, it's enough to drive you crazy. But at the end of the day, what they're really pushing, two primary agendas that affect the economic development business, is housing at all levels, affordable to market rate. We're just short on housing, and we can't drive the economy without places to live. And sustainability. I mean, we are shifting deliberately the state to sort of a net zero impact economy, to an alternative energy economy, and that's not going to change. And that affects what and how we define quality of life. And for us as economic developers, it impacts how we look at the landscape of doing transactions and creating value. And for all of us, it's really about value capture. We're no longer in a redevelopment business where we're investing, co-investing at any level in a public-private transaction. We have to find different ways to do it. And that means we come with housing policy, housing density, zoning permissions, and economic incentives. But be clear that all of the strategies that we'll talk to you about today are about capturing value and how you can use zoning, tax increment, and grants to pursue private investment in a qualified way. Next slide, please. So Couple of precepts about that. We said things have shifted. I'm going to come back and show you in an aggregate how everything has changed, but there are some things that really have dramatically changed. And the interesting notion in our state, because we have decided that housing is an urgency or necessity matter, in essence, our housing element is really an economic development program because two things have converged. One is housing's become the priority because it meets consumer demand because it's so unavailable for so many folks. And secondly, housing is a high value proposition because why? Because housing prices are high, demand is high, and people are living and working and shopping out of their economy, out of their house because we're in a digital economy. You can do it, which is shift the impact of retail from a store to a household and back and forth. So really what happens is to the extent that you can drive rooftops, you can drive spend. To the extent that you can have a community that has attractive uses that keep people there, you can keep those wallets locally and you can leverage that return to your economic development strategy. Next slide. That's a major shift. I mean, when I started as a city manager at Prop 13 range, it was all about getting sales tax and retail. Well, retail is a different equation today. Retail is a service business. Retail is an entertainment business. If you go to a shopping center, what you're seeing is a food store, restaurants, and the rest of the uses are literally about services, mostly about body parts, by the way, massage, health, hair. That's your context. The way you get folks out of the economic unit, which is the house today, as much as it is the office. To the extent that you get them out of that unit and into your community, you can value capture retail productivity for yourself. And guess what? You really won't be able to do that unless you have a collateral service platform called industrial. Because guess what? Industrial has become the delivery pipeline for retail, whether it's to the store or to the house. We're in a delivery economy, right? The famous Don Henley song, "We're a nation of noses pressed up against the glass. We see it on the TV now, internet. We want it really fast." So showroom economy says you go to the store, but you may order online. So between these consumer shifts and delivery shifts, we have a much different economic development equation. Next slide. That equation, by the way, is all across every real estate product type. Housing's no longer a loss leader. I've covered that. Retail just can't be retail anymore. It has to be combined with rooftops. That's why we're changing our zoning to enable density. It's not only state policy, by the way, it does it to us. We may or may not like it. But Cosmo's perspective is don't fight that trend, just use it strategically. We're going to show you how to value capture on zoning in a minute. But retail can't just be retail anymore because it doesn't work that way. Consumers don't look at it that way. And telework is really impacting the equation of whether we leave the community during the day or go somewhere else for a job. And industrial ties it together, whether we want it, whether we like it, between AI and the digitalization of our economy, industrial becomes a distribution point for all of these goods. Next slide. So it's a changed world, right? And if you take a look, I'm spending time with you on this because everything you'll see from these next presenters is how to captivate, how to leverage, how to get an aggregated surplus strategy for yourself based on consumer demand who want quality of life, want affordable housing, want amenities, essentials, and experience. So that means the old retail is not coming back. Everybody wants it in a 15-minute community. Investors who are just trying to figure out how to capture that wallet themselves, work with consumer demand shifts, change advance new technology that enables that, manage their supply chain risk, which is all coming home under a tariff program, and figure out how to make new live and work patterns work for their return on investment. And guess what? All of the policy that we have to deal with are about two primary things as it relates to economic development: climate, energy, and then housing. And there's money that comes with it. All of those sources have multiple dozens. Steve will tell you, they roll off his lips, all of these grant sources that trigger and start from and direct toward climate action, sustainability, energy resources, housing. That's where it is. If you look at, next slide, if you look at these trends, then you can understand that if you're in the economic development business today, you're really looking at infrastructure money that's coming under the auspices and under the tent of climate. When you see climate, don't think climate, think infrastructure, because that's where the money is. I'll show you in a second. When you think housing, I get the density is a tough pill for many, many communities, but it's a consumer demand equation, and it comes with wallets, and it comes with grant dollars and tax credits. And in this world today, as we sit right now, you're looking at a private sector economy that is sideways and challenged on the cost of money. And based on the stock market and where we're going in the economy, those rates aren't dropping very quickly. So the private sector needs public sector incentives in many cases to make their projects work. All of you that are talking with developers right now are experiencing delay, deferral, excuses. It's not about you, it's about them. Their capital is challenged, their capital is shorthanded, their capital is expensive. So guess what? We can help them if we want to, but we can only help them if we understand where our resources are coming from, and they're coming from climate and they're coming from housing. Next slide. So what does it mean specifically? We name this, the new economic development is green. Well, here's why, because you've got $1.6 trillion in addition to 10 billion from Prop 4 that is all about this kind of infrastructure. Roads, bridges, public transportation, and so on. Next slide. So the new formula, and what you'll hear from Joe, from Bonnie, from Brian, from Steve, is how to put these pieces together. Steve at the bottom, grant funding, right? Real estate strategies. Joe and Bonnie will talk about that, both in terms of climate resources and so on. New tax increment financing. Next slide, Joe will talk about that. I want to spend 1 minute, next slide, because I'm almost out of time, please. Move forward, I just want to make sure I cover this. In addition to this new federal funding, I want to underscore that we have this Prop 4 $10 billion coming, and that's coming very soon. So that's additional money. Next slide. And we have all of these categories of investment, Inflation Reduction Act, and the Inflation Investment and Jobs Act, which really allows us to take advantage of many of these resources, especially if we combine these resources with tax districts. Next slide. So one notion I'll leave with you, next slide, please, is that as you zone around your community, as you are working through developer applications, there's an opportunity to use your specific plan much more judiciously. Basically, you can approve new zoning, not provide it directly to the private sector property owner who's never going to do anything with that property, but give it to yourself, create a zoning bank, a development opportunity reserve, and then trade that zoning for amenities and infrastructure. Next slide. That's what we call value capture zoning, and you ought to do it when you're adopting your housing element. You ought to do it when you're looking at a specific plan. The day is gone where we go ahead and give zoning away without understanding the value we create with it. It's one of the few currencies we have to change or exchange for. Next slide. And so if you combine, Joe's going to talk to you about tax increment districts in 1 minute here. If you combine tax increment districts with the value capture that you can create and then put in a bank for yourself and trade out in a development agreement. So if you combine zoning value with tax increment capture, you have the basis for leveraging private investment because you've created two things: certainty of zoning and the ability to give them back some of the value they create in a special district through a tax increment reimbursement. In an interest challenged environment, in an environment where zoning is hard to get, those are two pieces of the equation that you bring to the table that you control as a public agency that you can trade for advancement of your community. Next slide. I'm just about done here. So housing density, you go ahead and you look at the properties in your community, you monetize your RENA compliance requirement by looking at zoning strategically from a value capture perspective, you create your bank, and you trade it out and you leverage that trade with TIF districts. Basically, a pretty straightforward strategy that, next slide, that everyone ought to be looking at. Housing, climate action, local priorities from the rest of the panel. Next slide, what you're going to hear from the rest of this panel is basically, one, how do you create these tax increment districts? That's Joe. Two, Bonnie, how do you use these districts? Bonnie comes to you with two hands basically in the game. She's looking at an EIFD district for downtown, and she's looking at a CRD, climate resilience district, for other areas of the community that have climate impacts. Brian, the state comes with money. He actually has some gifts. I don't think you'll get them today, but you'll get the knowledge about them today, including the infrastructure financing bank, which all of these state resources are dedicated primarily to housing and climate. And Steve is really the money guy. He really has the insight on where the pockets of grant dollars are that come through these primary categories that I've been talking about. When you put the information that all these four speakers will give you together, and you sort of step back and look at the strategy that I've just outlined to you, that's the process for the future. If you're in the economic development business, you're in the infrastructure business, you're in the climate business, you're in the housing business, you're in the consumer demand business, and you're using your low cost of money and your power zoning to engage private investment. So I'll turn this over to Joe. Thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So, and we're already seeing some of the feedback. There's so much good information here. It's exactly why I'm going to spend a few minutes on one of these sets of tools that Larry just talked about, because it does take a deeper dive to really get this. It takes some time. I'm going to be talking about the tax increment financing world. We call that TIF, and two tools in particular, and we'll touch on others: climate resilience districts, sometimes called those CRDs, and the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, the EIFD. We can go to the next slide. So many of the attendees on this call have some familiarity with TIF or tax increment financing. Others may know nothing. So we at least want to talk a little bit so we're not leaving folks behind. When we say TIF, it's not a brand new tool in California by any means. It has been around since the 50s, or 75 years. Some folks knew this decades ago as redevelopment agencies till 2012. And those are no longer in existence by state legislation. So we're talking today about what you have today as a city or a county or another public agency in terms of TIF. What it is, it's a method of value capture. Larry kept using the term value capture. You're drawing a boundary and you're taking advantage of future assessed property value growth within the boundary. And you're using that value creation to fund what's important to you as a city, county, or a group of public agencies in terms of public improvements, amenities, climate resilience investment, affordable housing investment, and I'll go into all of that. The key driving mechanism in this how it works section is that the private investment comes. That's the value driver. And as those buildings go vertical, it's creating taxable assessed values. And you're able, as a public agency, to put aside some of that growth and dedicate it to a specific set of uses. You, as the public agency, are in the driver's seat on how those dollars get used. That's what we mean when we say value capture. Following slide just puts a visual on it. Sometimes we find that it helps. Many folks have probably seen a graphic like this in the past. When we say TIF, you're drawing a specific boundary. Sometimes it's just the downtown or a few blocks, even some specific parcels. You may have a master plan in place or a large-scale development project. And that boundary is essentially freezing the baseline of property value when you're forming the district, the dark green on the bottom. And as that new private sector investment comes in and creates that new value, that's this lighter shade of green that is available. As a public agency, you're not having to put, all of your future property tax from that growth into one of these tools. You can do just some piece of it. And it's a balancing act in our experience. We're really just talking about some colors of property tax. There's different forms of property tax. And we're always balancing how much funding capacity to give this tool in this restricted fund for infrastructure and housing and climate resilience versus how much revenue we want to keep totally unrestricted for the general funds of a city, county, or other public agency, just to keep the lights on and provide municipal services. So these districts are temporary. They're in place for a particular duration. At some point, where the dark green comes back toward the far right, the district goes away and all the dollars go back to normal, so to speak. The district was formed. So next slide, we're never here to say, look, you do a TIF, it's the guarantee of success, it's a panacea, it does everything you need to do. No, not at all what we're saying. We think there are advantages of this set of tools, and there are also disadvantages. and it's not going to fix everything on its own. Some of the advantages, when you're doing these, you're not encumbering any of your existing city or county or other public agency revenues. If you do a geo bond, if you do a lease revenue financing to build a new fire station or some sort of new amenity, you are indeed encumbering some level of revenues that already exist today that you're banking on to keep your lights on as a city or county. With TIF, you're talking about earmarking a portion of future revenues. You're not tying up any of today's dollars. It's a good thing. The downside of it, to be fair, it's not the fastest money. You don't see the TIF dollars immediately. You need the value to grow first. Collaboration is a big strength of these tools. It's the ability, if you're a city, to potentially get a match from a county or a fire district or a water district or another special district to match your dollars. If you think of it like a retirement account, and you're putting a piece of your future property tax revenue, you can get a match. In this analogy, the county can be your employer, matching your allocation to your retirement account, matching you on a percentage basis or dollar for dollar. There's lots of flexibility there. And we're seeing more and more partnerships, cities and counties, fire districts, water districts, flood control districts, finding ways to solve mutual needs on infrastructure and climate resilience. Grant priority is a big one. We say OPM, other public money. It's setting yourself up to attract some of these other sources that Bonnie, Brian, and Steve will talk about. You're scoring better on grant applications by doing some of this more innovative stuff locally. Private sector is a big piece. You just heard Larry talk all about what the private sector needs to see if they're going to move money into a deal. Their money is getting more expensive. If you, as a city or county, are demonstrating a long-term commitment by restricting these dollars that would otherwise be unrestricted general fund property tax dollars, the private sector community that deals with cities know that's a real commitment and a lot different from just saying, oh, in next year's budget, we'll just earmark, X $100,000 or X $1 million. All it takes is a new city council to come in, perhaps even new, city manager or CAO on the county side, and that commitment goes away. That's different from this. This is a separate entity being set up, committing those revenues, and the private sector knows the difference. The last point, when we're talking about TIF, this is not a new tax. It's not a CFD or BID or any of these other acronyms you may be familiar with. If you're a resident or a landowner or business in one of these districts, you're not seeing any change on your tax bill, and you're not having any voter approval requirement. So these can be quite efficient to set up, and you're not angering a local constituency. So following slide, we're merely conveying you've got options if you go down the path of tax increment financing or TIF. We don't have enough time today to talk about all of these, nor do we think we need to. We're finding increasing focus on these top two on the left side here, the EIFD as mentioned, and the CRD. And I'll spend another minute on how these compare. We're happy to spend more time offline if folks want to hear about others. We saw questions from when folks registered about CREA, which is really more of an affordable housing focus, and we could be happy to talk about that in Q&A if we have time, or subsequently. But I want to dive a little bit deeper on EIFD and CRD. So we can go to EIFD on the next page. This is where we've seen most of the action so far in California. About 31 of these formed up and down the state, and they are long-term districts, 45 years plus. They can be stood up from the first meeting on this topic in 12 months. To 18 months. Some of them can take longer, especially in larger cities, or if you're grouping together more partners like cities, counties, and special districts. It has its own governing entity. That's important for a number of reasons. For one, if you're a city finance director or a county CFO, it's sort of an off-balance sheet way to fund things. Your general fund credit is not pledged. You're not pledging any assets that you own as collateral, city hall, streets, anything. It's nothing like that. It's a separate entity called the Public Financing Authority, stands on its own, has its own credit for the public finance market, and it has a business plan, the infrastructure financing plan. And you're required in these districts to be pretty clear about stuff. What are you going to pay for? What are the impacts? How much money are we talking about here? How long is this district going to be in place? You have to put all that in paper on the infrastructure financing plan. And then on the next point, you have to very transparently present that detail over a required set of hearings and meetings, ultimately resulting in an opportunity for folks to protest. Landowners and residents within the boundary can come out and protest if they don't like what they're hearing. And that's really your ultimate threshold. There's no vote, again, because we're not increasing taxes, but there is this protest opportunity. Eligible projects is quite wide, and the list is starts with the words including but not limited to. We're generally saying these are infrastructure and affordable housing tools. Next slide is the newest TIF tool in town. The climate resilience districts have been available since January of 2023. Very similar to the EIFD, the one that I just covered. You're just hearing more of a focus on climate resilience improvements. This law, again, uses those keywords, including but not limited to, so clearly with some flexibility. And then it lists some examples: sea level rise, flood control, response to extreme weather like drought, extreme heat, wildfires becoming more and more prevalent, especially in result of the Palisades fire, which I'll talk about. The additional powers beyond what an EIFD has, it can actually also levy a special tax. Bonnie may talk about that for Santa Cruz. So you're not just using tax increment, but you can also levy a new tax or assessment through one of these tools. And these have more administrative powers explicitly than an EIFD does. CRD can actually hire its own staff explicitly. So the following slide 31 just it goes a bit further into the types of things you can pay for. I won't dwell on it for sake of time, but very importantly, it starts with those words, including but not limited to. It's the capital improvements, it's the maintenance, and very importantly with CRD, it can also fund operations. So the next slide, 32, just want to share with you, there's lots of different shades of this thing. 31 across the state, fully formed, over 50 others in process, and they range so highly. From NorCal to SoCal, inland versus coastal, cities alone, counties alone, cities and counties, cities and fire districts, flood control, water district, so many different ways to use these, and the list keeps growing. Next slide, 33. We've already seen some questions when folks registered. How do you get cities interested, or how do you get counties interested in being your partner if you're a city? And I'll broaden that slightly. What if you want a fire district partner or a flood control partner? We're seeing more and more of this, fortunately. Of the 31 fully formed, 7 of them are city-county partnerships. We're seeing many counties do these on their own in unincorporated areas. Some of these, because that was another question we received, how about parts of a city and unincorporated county? Yeah, we've seen that in Palmdale. City of Palmdale and unincorporated LA County just outside Palmdale. Many counties have come out with policies to address how they might partner or even evaluate a city's proposal. Those are listed on this slide. And we know other draft policies are in progress. How to do it? It's a combination. You need solid numbers, positive ROI for any partner. If you're going to approach a county, show them what's in it for them. And we're finding it also takes a political angle. Are you addressing that local supervisor's policy goals? I'll keep going. And there's more to that if we can get into it. There's time in Q&A. Just one example case study, and we'll talk more about it in Q&A if there's time. Palisades fire. Larry talked about it. A very unique opportunity we're seeing that's being discussed is what happens if your value goes down? Can you capture that lower base with one of these tools? Absolutely. And that's why the CRD tool is a hot topic in the city of Los Angeles community in Palisades and also the Eaton area. And it's because of that ability to capture that growth. It's a motion approved by the council. It's on this slide. Happy to chat about that. It's just one example of how these are relevant in the climate resilience context. Final 2 slides. Actually, we could advance to my final slide because it's a very similar point. Just to wrap up here, what you're hearing is I talked a lot about tax increment. I also talked about how this tool set sets you up to attract yet other public dollars, especially grants. And I also mentioned that you're signaling very importantly to the private sector how serious you are as a public agency if you're committing a set of property tax revenues over a long term in a restricted fund. Our point is that TIF on its own, it's not going to solve all your issues, but it helps bring the pieces together. The grants that Bonnie, Brian, and Steve will talk more about, the private sector dollars that creates that investment that you're seeking to capture, and your own public sector revenues that you control locally. You're able to bring those other pieces together. And it takes all of that. That's what Larry says. We're saying it takes all of those pieces coming together for economic development to be successful. So that's it for my piece. I'll hang around for Q&A. But for now, I'll pass it to Bonnie to talk a little bit more about what Santa Cruz is doing.
Great. Thanks, Joe. So I'm going to talk about 2 case studies here in Santa Cruz. And first, I'll just provide a little bit of context so you can advance to the next slide. And the context is just Santa Cruz itself and the beauty of our area. And this really relates to why we're considering a climate resilience district, and you'll see a little bit more in just a moment. Next slide. So as you can see, and I'll show you on next slide, on where we're located, we are on the California coastline in the Central Coast area. This is our very long wharf, a half mile into the ocean. Next slide. And we're our iconic boardwalk right on the ocean. Next slide. And our very vibrant downtown. So we're focusing on these two areas today. What we hope to be our resilient coastline and the long-term sustainability of our downtown in downtown Santa Cruz and the connection between those two areas. Next slide. So first, just to show you where we are, if you're not familiar with Santa Cruz, we're about an hour and a half south of San Francisco. We're about 40 minutes from San Jose and about an hour north of Monterey. Next slide. I'm showing you the areas of our town, and the important aspect of this is, if you can see right through the middle, we have a river running through it. That's our San Lorenzo River. It does flood. We've had a few major flooding events that have flooded our entire downtown in the 50s, again in the 80s. More recently, in the 23-24 storms, we had some significant flooding in town as well. Next slide. You can see, you can look at the existing in the blue erosion hazard zone, and you can see over the next 50 to 60 years what that erosion is going to look like in Santa Cruz. And if you can see the area with the largest swath, you can see that's like prime in one of our downtown leading to our beachfronts, beach flat and downtown area, a critical area for us. Next slide. We also have significant flooding. Again, you can see the flooding map increases over time, includes completely our downtown area, major concern. Next slide. And then tsunami, again, our entire downtown beach flats area, good swaths of our city are in a tsunami hazard area. Next slide. And then both historic and recent major wildfires. In 2020, we had the CZU complex that got really close to Santa Cruz, and it actually was in the mountains right above us and displaced several thousand people. Over 1,000 people lost their homes. Next slide. 2023, 2024, the picture on the left is our West Cliff Drive, is probably our best known visitor attraction when you come to Santa Cruz. Beautiful coastline. Good portions of it fell in the ocean during 2023 and again in 2024 before we even had a chance to recover from it. And it really prompted a discussion and a whole planning effort by our community and by our city council. And our goal is, as you can see on the right, this is Big Sur, not Santa Cruz. But the goal is that we want to be strategic and proactive. We don't want to be reactive, which is how the situation we've been in for the last 5 years. Next slide. Unfortunately, another round of storms this last December, right before Christmas Eve, we got a call that our construction crews who were repairing the end of our half-mile wharf were trying to shore up before a major wave event was coming in. And unfortunately, because the end of the wharf had been compromised, we were replacing pilings. The big wave came and took out 180 feet of our wharf. And as you can see on the picture on the right, it has one of our project managers and a contractor actually fell into the ocean. They were both fine. But if we didn't already need that wake-up call that we need to not only be proactive, real things are happening now, we need to address the impacts of climate change. And this is what really has been the catalyst behind having our community engagement at the level that we really need to have proactive change. Next slide. So we have now in place a 25 to 2030 Santa Cruz Local Hazard Mitigation Plan and Climate Adaptation Plan, as well as a 2030 Climate Action Plan. And this is really the foundation for us being able to both solidify and codify the community's goals, priorities, and sort of the direction for us at the city to be able to move forward, apply for grants, move forward on different funding mechanisms to be able to address our needs in Santa Cruz. Next slide. So the council direction that we had, and this is prior to the wharf disaster, was to develop a community plan for West Cliff and move towards proactive implementation. So I'm going to focus first on the Climate Resiliency District. Next slide. These are the balancing that community vision is really looking at, okay, for the next 50 years, what do we need to do? And the compelling elements are listed here. I won't go through all of them, but I think it's important to recognize that the whole community identifies with being a coastal community and embraces the ocean. And at the same time, they recognize that climate change is real. Goals are, preserving the beauty, resiliency, and the continued use of this cherished resource within our community. Next slide. Here you can see, just so you can understand the magnitude of some of the repairs that we're dealing with. We have about 30 of these sinkholes. We have some ocean caves right beneath some of our roads. With erosion, they fall away, cause major road repairs. We're repairing these as we can. The cumulative cost of the last several years of storms far exceeds our ability of our general fund to, as we go, make these maintenance repairs. Next slide. You can see a few more of them, just shoring up infill walls, culvert areas. There's the cost of these just keep growing. Next slide. These are just examples of some of them, some of the different funding sources we've pulled together. What we've realized is as we're searching for grants and searching for these opportunities, is they often want to know what we're self-funding. What is Santa Cruz's commitment? And in order to be competitive, it's really part of the impetus behind moving forward with a climate resiliency district so that we can leverage and we can show that Santa Cruz is committed to leveraging our funds to bring in more state and federal resources into our community. Next slide. So we have a shared community vision. We have city council support and direction. We have, and I think this is really important for the Climate Resilience District, is that we have a community-wide feeling that we have to address this now. We have to look forward for the next 50 years, and our community is willing to actually tax themselves. And while there's a couple different mechanisms that you can pursue as part of a climate resilience district, we're specifically feeling like, because we have some other goals for the city, and I'll talk about that next, we particularly feel that a climate resilience district is appropriate to use the mechanism that actually would be a property tax as a component of it, because our entire community feels like we need to address this. And from some polling that we've done, and probably over 24 community outreach meetings, our community really does want to focus on addressing future climate change. So we think this is a good fit for Santa Cruz now and for the future. Next slide. Okay, now I'll talk about we're in process on our enhanced infrastructure financing district. We have a developmental league, the Santa Cruz Warriors, here in Santa Cruz, and we have and you can see it, a little white rectangle square in the middle of that red outline, a temporary arena that was supposed to be 10 years, and we're on year 13 right now. And we want to have a permanent home for the Santa Cruz Warriors in Santa Cruz. This area that's highlighted in red needs major public infrastructure investment. And our partners at the Golden State Warriors and some area developers that we've been meeting with over the last couple of years really want to see that investment from the city, that public investment in this area, if they're going to invest in building a new arena for Santa Cruz. Along with that, we have a 5-fold increase in our regional housing needs assessment for housing in our community. And we're in discussions of bringing in and developing probably up to 1,600 new residential units in this area in red. Combining with that, we're looking at creating an EIFD in order to leverage that investment by the private developers and the Golden State Warriors into a permanent arena. Next slide. This is just a view of the existing area, and you can see it's prime for some redevelopment. You'll notice a number of single and double-story buildings in this area. If we're taking this area and building 1,600 units, we're going to be looking at density. We're going to be looking at increased height, which has been controversial for our community. Next slide. Again, just some existing conditions. As you can see, some steep staircases, not a lot of public investment in making these feel attractive or safe for that matter. Next slide. And then this is our river walk. And remember that orientation slide I showed you at the beginning. We have a river running right along our downtown and it leads to the beach. Beautiful river, wonderful resource. We have not invested consistently. We've in fact turned our back to the river because of the flooding over the years, and you'll see the backs of buildings along the other side of this river walk pathway. We want to invest in public amenities, put in sidewalks in addition to the bicycle lanes, and really enhance this as a pedestrian pathway between our downtown and our beach area. Next slide. This is our vibrant downtown adjacent to it. We want to connect this area to the Warriors Arena area, create a new entertainment district as part of this public investments and enhancements. Next slide. And this is just a view of that connection. So where you see the outline, just north of that is our downtown. You can see the pathway along the San Lorenzo River, and part of the goal is to create a pedestrian sort of plaza in front of the new arena that really is oriented towards the Riverwalk and creating these pedestrian and just community new plaza areas and places for public gathering. As I mentioned earlier, we do have controversial heights and project perceptions. We're specifically been working in and meeting with both the property owners in this area, but also working with our developers in the area. There is business support both in the downtown and this south of Laurel area for an EIFD, but broadly citywide, there is some concern about the density and housing density in this area. City Council feeling is they really absolutely want to secure the Warriors, but they have some mixed feelings about the residential development and the height in this area, which traditionally, as you saw, has been 1 to 2 stories. So when we looked at an EIFD in this area, we included and looked at what is the upcoming development in our commercial corridors, and including the 1,600 units that will be developed in this area. If we can leverage this investment now and leverage the ability to really bring in the private development and that private investment, that we can secure the Warriors. So this is not a new tax, as Joe said, and that was really important both for our council and for the broader area. We don't have residential areas in this. These are largely all commercial areas and some multifamily projects. But that was really the key point. When we went to City Council, we didn't have anyone come and speak directly in opposition, strongly in opposition, and we did have a number of supporting members of the community. We had a webinar, very supportive. So we're in the first stages of a resolution of intention for an EIFD, and this really is our ability to create a long-term sustainable downtown and investment for all of our brick and mortar businesses. Next slide. Just wrapping up a few more images of what the new area will look like. Next slide. And next slide. This is the Spruce Street Plaza area. As I said, we're really creating an entertainment district south of our downtown. Next slide. And next slide. Great. So again, just to wrap up, we're increasing our housing and our grant opportunities. We found that we've been successful in securing over 120 million to our downtown through our affordable housing projects, through affordable housing sustainable communities, infill and infrastructure grants. And by creating an EIFD, we'll be even more competitive for future grants in the south of Laurel area. We'll secure it for our downtown warriors, and will enable our private sector partners to move forward with that investment in our area. So we're excited to move forward, and hopefully within the next year, we'll be able to start off on our climate resilience district as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Great example of how this is being used on the ground already. So now we're going to pivot to Brian's presentation. If you're ready, Brian.
Yes, thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you to you and ILG for hosting this webinar, and to Larry and Cosmos for moderating it. I want to say good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to join you all today. My name is Brian Coleman, and I serve as the Project Financing Manager at the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, also known as GoBiz. And today I'll be sharing how California is leading the way in advancing the green economy. And I'll also be talking about some of the, be providing a high-level overview of some of the historic investments the state is making in clean energy and climate-friendly initiatives. Next slide, please. So before we dive into California's green economy initiatives, I'd like to just give a brief overview of our office and the role we play in shaping California's economic landscape. GoBiz is California's lead agency and primary point of contact for economic development and job creation efforts. We sort of serve as a one-stop shop for businesses, local communities, site selectors, and any other economic development stakeholders that are looking to grow and thrive in the state of California. Our services include things like permitting assistance, site selection support, regulatory compliance, incentive navigation, and then acting as a liaison to other state agencies as well as some federal partners. Next slide, please. So GoBiz is comprised of several specialized teams that are focused on promoting different areas of California's business ecosystem. These include units dedicated to business investment, clean energy and climate change mitigation, emerging technologies, and international trade. And then we also have a number of sister agencies that we work closely with, such as the California Film Commission, the Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, which I will be discussing in more detail later on in my presentation. We have the Office of the Small Business Advocate, which focuses on providing financing and technical assistance to small businesses throughout the state. And then there's also Visit California, which acts as the state's destination marketing organization. And then I also want to point out a new unit that was formed at GoBiz, and it's the unit that I'm a part of. It's the Regional Economic Development Initiatives team. This team was organized to support local governments and community partners in helping them reach their economic development goals. So if any communities out there, if any of you are looking for support with identifying funding, financing needs, you can get in touch with our office and we'd be happy to offer support. All of our services are free, and you can connect with us through our website, which is business.ca.gov. Fortunately, I don't have it up here on the slide, but can provide that link in any follow-up material. Next slide, please. So now that you have a little bit more background about our office, I want to shift gears and talk about the major public investments California is making to build a green economy. So in 2022, the state committed $54 billion through the California Climate Commitment, and this was intended to combat climate change and promote various clean energy initiatives. These funds are supporting a variety of activities, and some examples include things like supporting clean transportation. So roughly $10 billion has been dedicated to zero emission vehicles and building out zero emission vehicle infrastructure. $1.1 billion has been dedicated to assisting low-income Californians retrofit their homes with energy efficient appliances, and then also helping to decarbonize buildings. And then $315 million has been allocated to train and employ clean energy workforce that's dedicated to working in sustainable industries. Now, some of this funding was reduced last year due to the budget cuts. In fact, I think approximately $9.4 billion was removed from this initiative. However, the recent passage of Proposition 4 that Larry mentioned earlier is expected to help mitigate this shortfall. And I'll be chatting a little bit more about Prop 4 in a bit. These investments are being complemented by an unprecedented level of federal funding as well, thanks to key pieces of legislation like the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS and Science Act. And so altogether, these investments are unlocking billions of dollars for green economic development, and they are presenting a once-in-a-generation opportunity for communities to secure funding for various infrastructure and clean energy projects. Next slide, please. And so all these investments are supporting very ambitious goals that the state of California has set for itself. As you can see on the screen, we have some very ambitious targets. We plan to achieve 100% clean energy and economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2045. By 2030, we aim for 60% of our electricity to come from renewables, so things like solar, wind, hydrogen, those types of renewable energy sources. Other targets that the state is aiming for: 100% of all new trucks sold must be zero emission vehicles by 2035. With new drayage trucks required to meet this standard sooner than that, actually as early as 2025. All new locomotives in California must be zero emission by 2047. And then we are also aiming for developing 25 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2045. And we're hoping to have about 2 to 5 gigawatts of offshore wind electricity by 2030. So all these targets reflect California's bold vision and commitment to making long-term investments in the green economy. And they are also strong indicators that the state will continue its investment in clean energy and infrastructure in the coming decades. Next slide, please. So California has a proud tradition of bringing groundbreaking climate projects to life, and we lead the nation in many first-time accomplishments, including things like the first fully electric container crane terminal in Long Beach, the first all-electric top handlers in Los Angeles, the first hydrogen fuel cell switching locomotive in Sacramento, the first all-electric tugboat and all-electric crane in San Diego, and the first all-electric forklifts in Sacramento and Stockton. And all these projects, basically what they demonstrate, they set a standard for what's achievable in clean infrastructure and technology, and they serve as a model for the rest of the nation to follow. Next slide, please. So now I want to zoom out a little bit and take a broader look at some of the additional investments being made in California. Over the past few years, $1.5 billion have been allocated for goods movement and freight infrastructure programs via the California State Transportation Agency, or CalSTA. And this is all part of the state's efforts to build a more efficient and sustainable supply chain. Over $2 billion has been allocated for heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, which is being distributed by multiple agencies such as the Air Resources Board, the Energy Commission, and the Pollution Control Financing Authority. The state was also a recipient of a $1.2 billion Arches Hydrogen Hub designation from the U.S. Department of Energy. And this is a statewide public-private partnership that's dedicated to advancing the hydrogen economy across California. And then, as I mentioned earlier, as Larry mentioned earlier, Proposition 4 was passed this past year, and this authorizes the state to issue $10 billion in general obligation bonds to fund a variety of projects aimed at enhancing the state's resilience to climate change. And some of that allocation of funds include things like $3.8 billion for safe drinking water and water resilience, $2 billion for wildfire prevention and extreme heat mitigation, nearly $2 billion for protection of natural lands, parks, and wildlife, and then an additional $850 million for various clean energy projects and infrastructure. And so what all this allocation of funding reflects is California's commitment to continual investing in initiatives like environmental protection, climate resilience, and clean infrastructure. Next slide, please. I won't go into too much detail on this slide, but just wanted to highlight that there are strategic investments being directed towards other high growth sectors in the state. Sectors like clean technology, critical minerals, and then also high-tech industries of the future like AI, robotics, semiconductors, aerospace, quantum computing, those types of industries. Next slide, please. So I do want to spend a little bit of time highlighting a very important resource that has been critical in supporting California's economic growth and sustainability efforts, and that is the California Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, or iBank. iBank serves as the state's general purpose financing authority, and it provides critical funding for various types of infrastructure and economic development projects. Some of its key programs include the Infrastructure State Revolving Fund, which provides direct loans for various types of infrastructure and community development projects. There's the Bond Financing Unit, which is designed to assist public, private, and nonprofit entities in obtaining both tax-exempt and taxable bonds for a wide range of projects. And the Small Business Finance Center, which also offers a suite of loan programs aimed at increasing capital access for small businesses. And then a recent initiative or program that was formed is the Climate Financing Unit, which provides various types of direct loans and flexible climate financing for clean energy projects and climate initiatives across the state. Next slide, please. Okay, so just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and kind of briefly go through these last couple of slides. Kind of want to pivot and talk about the work being undertaken with the California Jobs First Regional Investment Initiative. For those unfamiliar with this initiative, this is a state program that was launched in the spring of 2022 with the goal of promoting inclusive and sustainable economic development across California's diverse regions. The state has invested $286 million in this initiative. This funding is designed to help regions advance their economies and also foster the creation of high growth and high-paying industries across the state. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So that initiative began with a 2-year planning process where planning entities across the state engaged with community stakeholders and conducted research to determine which industry sectors they wanted to attract or expand in their regions. And all that planning culminated last fall when each region submitted their economic blueprints to the state. Using this information, the state of California developed a statewide economic blueprint that has a set of unified goals, state level goals, and industry sectors we want to target investments towards. And if anyone wants to view that blueprint and learn more about the California Jobs First initiative, there was a link on the previous slide, and happy to include that link in any follow-up materials. But as you can see from this slide, the economic blueprint identifies some key strategic sectors that the state is planning on prioritizing over the next several years. And these sectors have been divided into 3 broad categories. As you can see, there's a strengthened group, which are sectors where California has an established competitive position, but there might be a leveling of growth and wages, so more opportunity to expand and grow. There's the accelerate group, which are sectors that have moderate to high projected growth and are ready for expansion, and where additional investments in capital and infrastructure could bend the curve to generate additional growth. And then we have the bet group, which are emerging sectors that have significant investment or high strategic importance to the overall innovation ecosystem in California. And so in the coming years, state investments will focus on supporting the industries that are identified in the accelerate and bet sectors. And as you can see from the graphic on the screen, many industries in the clean economy space are identified in those sector categories, which indicates huge potential for further or future investment and development in the clean economy in California. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Melissa or Larry to introduce Steve with California Consulting, and he'll provide a little bit more in-depth information on the types of funding and grants available at the federal and state level. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Brian. And just want to do a quick time check for our panelists before we jump into our last one. So Steve, I don't want to rush you through this, but I just want to make sure that we also still have some time for questions at the end. So without shortchanging anything, if we can go through this quickly, we should still have time for a couple of questions.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. Everybody hear me okay? Great.
We can.
I'll jump right in. First, I want to thank Melissa and ILG. ILG does a fantastic job. They are very valuable resources for cities and counties and special districts across California. They're superb in what they do, and I want to express our gratitude to Cal Consulting, to ILG, also to Cosmont. Nobody's better in the economic development world venue than Cosmont. They're second to none. Great to have Brian on from the governor's office, and Bonnie. Congratulations, new deputy city manager. Bonnie Limscomb from the city of Santa Cruz, our client, by the way. So congratulations to Bonnie. I'm going to go through this rapidly, as Melissa mentioned, but there's a lot to cover. Big picture wise, Cal Consulting, we're writing more grants than we've ever written. I know you might be seeing things in the media, on TV, in the newspaper about all this turmoil and turbulence with federal grants. We're writing more grants than we've ever written. We've been in existence for 21 years. And we're going to talk about some of those grants this afternoon at the federal level and the state level. So federal and state climate grant opportunities, how municipalities can access climate resilience and action funding. Let's go to the next slide. A little bit of background about Cal Consulting. 1,600 plus competitive grant applications we've written. We mostly write federal and state grant applications. We brought in $1.6 billion for our clients. We have 135 clients, approximately. Those are cities, school districts, counties, special districts, few nonprofits, but mostly public agency clients across California. Let's go to the next slide. Infrastructure funding. Go to the next one. A lot of infrastructure funding. We'll start with HMGP. This is an extremely popular grant. We're writing 15, 20 HMGPs right now. It's through California Office of Emergency Services. You can use it for hazard mitigation. So pushing back brush from buildings, emergency generators for all your city and county owned buildings, anything hazard mitigation related, flood control. We write a ton of HMGP grant applications. That grant's out right now. USDA community facilities grants and loans, that's the rural development. USDA community facilities, the CF grant we call it. Smaller grant, but nevertheless popular. And then charging infrastructure for government fleets. This is for a city or county that has government vehicles or needs government vehicles, EV, and also vehicles and EV. Let's go to the next slide. I want to go through this as rapidly as I can, as I mentioned. CFI is the big federal charging fueling infrastructure grant. This grant is new. I believe this is year 2 or 3. We've written it many times. This is one of the only grants that funds both the EV chargers and also funds the infrastructure for the chargers. And as I have learned from our grant writers who are experts in these fields, in this field in particular, it's the infrastructure that costs a lot more than the chargers. The chargers are not that expensive. The infrastructure is very expensive. So CFI is a popular grant. Strategic Growth Council, we work very closely with them. They have a grant called Community Resilience Center. It should be out later this year, should be due in the summer, we hope. This grant is for warming centers in the winter. It's for cooling centers in the summer. Very popular grant. We write it a lot. And then the last one on this slide is a federal EPA Clean Heavy Duty Vehicle grant, which we also have written in the past. We've written all these grants. So every single grant we're mentioning, Cal Consulting is written. We have 54 staff members. Our grant writers have written these grants many times. Let's go to the next slide. Staying on infrastructure, there's an EV Jumpstart grant. FEMA BRIC, I want to stop on this one for a second. Very popular grant. It's complex. It's intricate. It looks like this when it's done. 100-page application. You have to do a benefit cost analysis. But this is a great grant. BRIC is very, very popular. We just had one funded for a city in Southern California in the last round. We expect it to be out again. It can fund a multitude of different things regarding building resiliency. BRIC is one to definitely keep your eye on. CDBG, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on CDBG. Excuse me. This one is one that I think probably everybody is very familiar with on this webinar. Let's go to the next slide, please. The California Energy Commission FAST 2.0 is one that we also write, a grant that some of you may be familiar with. CEC has a ton of great grants, just like California Air Resources Board does. There are more infrastructure grants we could talk about, but for the sake of time and brevity, let's go to the next slide. Roads, bridges, and public transportation. So please go to the next slide. First one on this list is CMAQ and STBG. These are grants that we write. We've written for 21 years. CMAQ is congestion mitigation air quality. It's usually through your local MPO, your local COG. Extremely popular grant. The very first one of these we got funded was for a school district for buses, CNG buses. You can also use this. Cities can use it. Counties can use it. EV, CNG fueling stations, all sorts of things can be funded under these two grants. Low or no grant is what we call it. That's a U.S. Department of Transportation. We call it the low or no emission grant. Again, for buses, bus facilities, competitive. All these grants we're talking about are competitive. We don't write the fill in the blank, send it in, automatically get an allocation types of grants. We write the most competitive federal and state grant applications. This is a good one. And then LTCAP. This is a California Transportation Commission grant, should be out later this year. Local transportation climate adaptation planning. We write several of these. I would put this one more towards the popular list for our city and county clients. I wouldn't say it's the most popular, but I would say it definitely is popular. We can go to the next slide. We're on roads, bridges, and public transportation. Safe Streets and Roads for All, SS4A. This is definitely near the top of the list for most popular. This came out in the last presidential administration as part of the Build Back Better America plan. Fantastic grant. This is a stellar grant for public works departments. We've written it now since the first year it came out, which I believe was 2 years ago, had several of them funded. It's a grant that can fund public works projects, both planning and or implementation. So if you're a public works, city or county, SS4A should be at the top of your list. HSIP, this is what I call an oldie but a goodie. This grant's been around a long time. We've written it since the very first year it came out. Highway Safety Improvement Program. If you have safety issues on your streets or roads, or bike lane issues where there's danger, there's accidents, there's pedestrians getting hit by cars, or bicyclists getting hit by cars, HSIP is a grant to take a very close, careful look at and consider. We had 16 HSIP applications funded at Cal Consulting in this very last round. Extremely, extremely popular grant, HSIP. Caltrans and USDOT both have a Reconnecting Communities Program grant that should be out. Both should be out later this year. You could take a look at Reconnecting Communities. I'm going through this fast, as Melissa suggested, but definitely one to consider. Let's go to the next slide. Roads, bridges, and public transportation. We're staying on this subject. Thriving Communities, that's a federal grant for disadvantaged communities. That could change. I need to make a note for everyone. The new administration in Washington has said that their goal is to eliminate the favorability for disadvantaged communities. So in other words, in federal grants, as you probably know, if you're familiar with grants, there's 5 points, 10 points, 7 points, whatever it is in the guidelines if you're a quote unquote disadvantaged community. The new administration has said they want to do away with that in federal grants. They want all cities, all counties to be treated equally. So there'll be in their words, a level playing field, and disadvantaged communities will not receive an advantage. That was great news for our more affluent clients at California Consulting. That was bad news for some of our disadvantaged clients at California Consulting. Take a look at the Thriving Communities Grant. Definitely one to consider. Sustainable transportation, we write a lot of these. I'm going to say we probably wrote 10, maybe even more than a dozen of these in the last cycle. It's Caltrans state grant. 2026 is the projection on that one. ATP, probably everybody on the Zoom who's in the grant world has heard of ATP, active transportation. This is flashing crosswalks, flashing stop signs, bike lanes. Very, very popular grant. Maybe possibly the most popular grant in this whole slide deck, ATP. And it's out every other year. So it was out in 2024, be out again in 2026. Go to the next slide, please. Economic development. And the next slide, the very first grant I want to mention on economic development is the best economic development grant. It's the EDA Public Works grant. And the reason it's the best, and we're writing, 12, 13, 14 of these right now for cities and counties, is it funds infrastructure. It funds on-site and off-site infrastructure. A great example, we work very closely with EDA, talk to them at least once a week. The very best example, and EDA uses this example, we've written this grant for 21 years, is city or county has a business that wants to come in. They're going to create new jobs. And they say, you know what, we're going to bring our business, we're going to create 50, 100, 150 new jobs, whatever it is. But there's infrastructure needed. There's a sewer line extension that's needed, or parking structure, some offsite or onsite publicly owned infrastructure. And the developers, the business says, we don't think we should have to pay for that. That's public infrastructure. The city should have to pay. County should have to pay. You want us to come and locate our business there, create these jobs, create this revenue for you, you should have to pay. That's where EDA comes in. EDA funds the public onsite and offsite infrastructure. We used to get EDAs funded for 10, 15, 20 million. Right now, the max is about 4 million on an EDA, but it's a great grant, a grant that we write a lot. EDA also has other grants. They don't just have the PWEAA, even though that's the one we write the most. They have a build to scale and they have a recompete. So take a look at the build to scale and recompete. Let's go to the next slide. CDBG, an HCD grant that I think most people probably are very familiar with, been around forever. Let's go to housing. We can go to the housing slide. The very first, thank you for flipping the slides, by the way. The very first housing grant we want to talk about is Infill Infrastructure Grant, or the IIGP grant. It's a state grant through HCD. We write it frequently. It helps developers, but it also helps cities and counties as well. So great example on the IIGP grant is you have a developer that's coming to your city or coming to your county. They want to do affordable housing. They're doing their pro forma. They're coming up short. They're in the red. they need some help, this grant can help them. Infill infrastructure, and the other really popular one we'll talk about later is AHSC. Those are grants that really are geared towards helping affordable housing developers. Do they help cities? Absolutely. That's why cities hire us to write it. Do they help counties? Absolutely. But affordable housing developers really benefit from IIGP and a grant we're going to talk about later called AHSC. Multifamily housing, MHP, definitely a grant that we work on. Joe Cerna, farm worker, you probably have heard of that, very well-known program. Let's go to the next slide. Veterans housing and homeless, the VHHP program. That one is going to be due here very soon. HomeKey Plus, you've heard of HomeKey, turning the motels into housing. This is HomeKey Plus, a little bit more permanent supportive housing, a lot of similarities with HomeKey. Take a look at that one. We expect it to be due here at the end of May. AHSC, I just mentioned it. I want to stop on AHSC for a second. This is, I would say, and I think our grant writers would agree, the most popular affordable housing grant that exists. We write it frequently. It is a large, complex application, one of those monster applications, but we have had them funded, and AHSC is a great grant for affordable housing. Let's go to the next slide. So HomeKey and HomeKey Plus are popular, but Encampment Resolution Fund is probably the most popular grant for the unhoused. And we think the reason for that is because it's permanent supportive housing. It's not just convert a motel, put the unhoused in here, and go from there. This is wraparound services, a case manager, workforce training, system support, as it says. It's really wraparound services for the unhoused. So Encampment Resolution Fund, extremely popular. We've written a lot of them. We will continue to write them as long as they're available. HHAP, another homeless housing assistance grant. And then that's HCD, that's a state grant. And then the last one on this slide is a federal HUD grant, the Pro Housing Grant. We have written this one before. We will write it later this year. I'm sure our clients are going to want it again. Let's go to the next slide, please. Pathways to removing obstacles. Let's talk about that one. CDBG, we talked about that one. CalHome is an HCD grant. CalHome has been around a long time. It should be out next year and is a grant that's, I would say, popular with cities. You probably have heard of it. There's the regular home, which we call Fed Home, and then the CalHome, which is HCD CalHome program. Let's go to the next slide. Permanent local housing allocation. There's a formula one and there's a competitive one. ESG, I'm going to say Emergency Solutions Grant. ESG is right up there with ERF, Encampment Resolution Fund, as far as popularity. The COCs are very involved in this. So if you're going to write an Emergency Solutions Grant on your own or with us or whomever, utilize your COC, your continuum of care. They're on top of the ESG grant, and they're usually intimately involved with the application. REAP 2.0, local grant for MPOs, usually for MPOs. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to go through this as fast as I can. Sustainability, climate action. Let's go to the next slide. Thriving communities, CPRG, climate pollution reduction. That is a very good grant. If you have climate issues, pollution issues, and GHG emission issues in your city or in your county, take a close, hard look at CPRG. Great US EPA grant. Thriving communities is good too, but CPRG, really good. Extreme heat is a new grant. Came out of the governor's office. So thank you, Brian, and Governor Newsom's office. Extreme heat and community resilient program should be out later this year. We did write it in the first year. We will write it again this year. And another governor's office grant from the state adaptation planning grant program. Now let's go to the next slide, please. TCC, Transformative Climate Communities, another large grant through the State Strategic Growth Council that I mentioned earlier. We do a lot with SGC. Strategic Growth Council has a lot of grants. We like them. So take a look at Transformative Climate Communities. ECRG, ECRG, Equitable Community Revitalization Grant, later this year. WaterSmart, federal U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. So if you need SCADA upgrades, if you need water meter installation, if you need to purchase water meter, electronic water meter readers, there are 2 water smart grants, a smaller one and a larger one, federal U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and we write a lot of water smart grants. EPA came out with the Environmental and Climate Justice Community Change Grant. This is year 2, I believe. We did write this grant for several clients. We had some success with it. It is a large and complex federal grant, but it can fund many, many different things. And it is new and therefore popular, because whenever new money hits the street, especially federal grants, it gets popular. Last grant on this slide, Carl Moyer. This is given out by the air districts in each region. So it depends on what air district you're in, Bay Area AQMD or South Coast AQMD or wherever you are. Moyer's a great grant. Got a lot of success writing Moyer, and we like it, and our clients, more importantly, our clients like it. Next slide. We put one slide in here on Prop 4. There's $10 billion in Prop 4. So nothing to sneeze at. The voters approve this. The money's coming out. There's even parks money in Prop 4. So we talked to OGALs. We work closely with a lot of the state and federal agencies on grants, and they told us there's park grant money coming out on Prop 4. So Prop 4 touches a lot of tentacles, touches a lot of different areas. Definitely take a look at Prop 4. This money is going to be rolling out here over the next 6 to 12 months. Next slide, please.
I am going to jump in here, Steve, because we've only got about 3 minutes left. But I do want to assure everybody that we'll send out the rest of these slides. I know that you've got some success stories in here that will definitely be held. We'll put out in the slide deck as we get there. But I did want to reserve, I've seen a lot of questions come through, so I want to take a couple of minutes here at the end to have you guys opine. If I can get everybody to come back on camera for me. Everybody still here?
Yep.
Perfect.
We're on.
I've seen a ton of questions come in, and Joe, you touched on this a little bit, but I just want to spend our last few minutes talking about partnership opportunities. How can cities and counties work together? Is there a tribal component to this? How do nonprofits jump in? So if we can go around maybe 60 seconds apiece, talk about partnership opportunities or recommendations and tips on how to do that.
Can I just start on that? I'd say that I've never seen a set of statutes that really lends itself more to public-public partnerships than EIFDs and CRDs, because the eligibility is just, if you want to join the PFA, you just have to commit some revenue. And here's what you have to know. These plans, they're not blight plans, they're not redevelopment plans. These are business plans. And what you need to do as a city or a county is go to each other and say, look, it's like going to a lender or an investor. Here's what's in it for you. Here's what's in it for us. We both commit this. And but for us doing this, these regional improvements, these local improvements, these public amenities just don't happen. That's really the equation that I can just tell you works up and down the state. And you'd be surprised for a city how your local supervisor can become the champion, because once you get one supervisor with one district, there are 4 more districts ready to happen in other parts of the county. It's amazing how that set of politics works for you. So it's surprising. It's not easy, but it's surprisingly achievable.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Anybody else have tips or thoughts on partnerships?
I'll add to Larry's comments. We're seeing on the education side, institutions get involved, whether it was University of Laverne and Laverne, Cal State Dominguez Hills and Carson, University of Redlands and Redlands. A lot of it is educational, is an amenity to the community. And if nothing else, sometimes it's just advocacy that helps the plans move forward. While entities like school districts cannot contribute property tax increment, they can absolutely be beneficiaries of the funding, whether it's directly for their facilities, or they can be beneficiaries of infrastructure that supports an area within a community. And the same would apply for tribes.
Yeah.
And while we continue this conversation, I'm just going to put everybody's contact information up too. I know there was a lot of questions we didn't get to, so feel free to follow up with us. But I do want to open it up if Brian or Bonnie or Steve has any other closing thoughts on partnerships. in
Yeah,
this.
I would just say to find common ground. I know in Santa Cruz, we have such a critical need for affordable housing development. So in meeting with our county, and that was where we found common ground, was that commitment of, by partnering together, we can create workforce housing, we can create affordable housing. And it really met some of their needs, particularly for employer-sponsored housing in Santa Cruz. So look for areas where that leveraged investment makes sense. If you're trying to get other taxing entities to participate with you.
Find the win-win, right?
Yeah, I think that was well said, Bonnie. I'll just add from the state side, I would definitely encourage everyone to get involved with the California Jobs First initiative in their regions. I'll be happy to include a link to our website that lists all the regions. Right now, there's a lot of planning and implementation underway to support not just these high growth strategic industry sectors, but also to facilitate infrastructure planning, community development planning as well. And one of the things that our office is going to look at is encouraging regions to develop tax increment financing districts to attract additional funding from the state. And so definitely would encourage everyone to get in touch with their regional collaboratives with the California Jobs First initiative.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Steve, any thoughts? I know this comes up a lot on grant applications as well in terms of community engagement and community organization partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. To the extent that application could be collaborative in nature, city including a county including a city, school district included, Parks and Rec district included. To the extent there's collaboration, it always helps in the scoring rubric.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. And so I know we are at time, so I just want to thank our attendees for joining us for their lunch hour, and our panelists for joining us and sharing their expertise. And Larry, I know I skipped over a couple of your final slides, so I want to give closing thoughts to you if you have anything you want to leave this group with.
No, the most important thing is we are in a new economy and a new world of public and public-private partnerships. If you can understand that your private partners are truly challenged and you have some ability to bring what I call gifts, whether it's grants or tax increment reimbursements or zoning bonuses or zoning density in specific parcels that you negotiate with, those are all advantages that you can use very, very selectively, very strategically to move your community forward. It's a new era. It's time to really get your arms around these tools and put them to work, because it's the new game in town. It's not going to change for a while.
Perfectly said. Great closing thoughts. Everybody who's still on the line with us, we will be sending out the slide deck and recording, as I mentioned at the beginning, as well as a number of the links and resources that you heard our panelists mention. We'll make sure to aggregate all of that so you have it in one place. And thank you again. And please, again, join me in thanking our fantastic panelists for this afternoon.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you, everyone.